Hey, sickos. I'm LJ,
And I'm Tao.
and this is.
Say psycho right now.
Welcome to the
Good
party.
to have you back. Welcome.
So, before we
welcome.
get things started, I feel like
Welcome to the shit show. Oh, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
fact. This is in fact a shit show. So, before we really get into the case today,
Hmm.
I think we just need to talk about what happened in the world of our pod this week.
Oh, what? Oh, yes. The world of our pod this week.
I don't know why you sounded so confused for a second, because everybody who's anybody who listens to true crime knows the Morbid podcast. Ash and Elena
Yes.
from Morbid,
Yes.
icons, like true crime podcast goddesses. And I submitted a listener tale. Listener tale 72 has my story in it. And anyway, they ended up shouting out our pod. That said, we changed our name, as you guys know, so they shouted us out by our old name. I literally couldn't even care. I was just so happy.
But people are sleuths. They still found us.
Yes, that's what I was gonna say. Like, Morbid
Yeah.
ended up like catching on, and they put like a reel on Instagram, like correcting our new name.
Yeah.
The girls from the Don't Tell My Therapist podcast, ironically, full circle, we've like connected with them now, and they've
Yeah.
shouted us out to make sure that you guys were able to find us a little bit easier. I've actually started listening to their podcast too, so you guys should check them out. They're really funny. But yeah, no, just what a cool week. Our streams have been up a fair amount, and I mean, I won't speak for Toe, but I'd pretty much resigned myself to the fact that like there were pretty good odds that we were just going to be like doing this, but like talking to ourselves for 6 months.
Yeah, I think that was a fair expectation. Now, by
Yeah.
the time this episode airs, this will probably be old news, but
Yeah, it will be, but for us, real time, like,
for us in real time right now, this is what's happening.
and we just wanted to say like how cool it's been and how humbling, honestly, because like I
Yeah.
never thought that they would even like that the listener tale would ever even make it on their podcast to begin with. But then for so many people to make the effort to make sure you guys find us, so many of you guys to sleuth us out and like listen and engage with us. It's just been really cool. And I also think that this would be a really appropriate time to shout out Savannah, our artist who did our cover art. Morbid gassed her up.
We love Savannah. She, like LJ said, she did our cover art and she's fantastic.
Yeah, and all her socials, in case anybody is like ever wondering, like her portfolio is really diverse. She basically, I sent her reference photos. I told her exactly what I wanted, and she like just boop, picked it out my brain, put it on paper. I was like,
Literally,
what the hell? Like, okay. Okay,
And
Savannah.
she's also just really great to work with aside from being a very talented artist. She's like a really cool human to work with, super easygoing and you know,
She's just a cool person. She even like coded her website from scratch. She didn't need to, she just could. You know, she just like learned how to because she just wanted to because she's just like that kind of gal. Um,
it's giving niche talents to which I can
it
relate.
It's giving queen energy. So Savannah Shenanigans, if you guys ever want to check her out, we don't acknowledge that enough, and I want to make it a point to just shout her out because she gave us our cover art, and our cover art is what draws people in a lot of the times. They don't know about our
Yeah.
brand. All they know is that image, and girl, you just
Yeah. They're
chef's
like,
kiss.
wow, two whores in plague masks? That sounds like something I want to listen to.
Cruella de Vil smoky stick. Give me more. God. So
Cruella DeVille smoky stick. Jesus.
well, we won't like bore you guys too much more with the banter, ye old
Mm.
banter, because we've got a big old case today, Toby.
Oh, we sure do. We
So tell
have.
me about what we have today, buddy.
So today's case is the case of Elizabeth Smart.
Which I'm really excited to hear from your perspective because I know we like vaguely
Yeah.
touched on it in another episode, and
Um,
I'm
I think.
familiar, but you have like a lot more insight as to
Yeah, and I
Dr.
think it's also the first time in Say Psycho Right Now history that Toe doesn't talk about murder.
Oh my god, slow clap, slow clap.
Slow clap. Okay, so a lot of you have probably heard this case before. This was a really big case in the news at the time, right? Um,
Right.
it got a lot of coverage, so I'm sure a lot of you have, heard of it. So, Elizabeth Smart was born on November 3rd, 1987, and she was the second of six children born to Ed and Lois Smart. Now, they lived in a very large home.
Right.
Okay, very large. There's pictures out there on the internet. You guys can go look it up. Maybe we'll post that on our Instagram or something. But, these people were not hurting, clearly. But they lived in a very upscale neighborhood in Salt Lake City, Utah, and she had seemingly a lovely childhood. And she was described as mild mannered and well behaved, and she enjoyed, typical young girl stuff such as playing with dolls. And she also played the harp, and she was said to be quite good at it. Now, later on in an interview, Elizabeth herself said she grew up like many young girls, looking forward to her own happily ever after, waiting for the day to come when she met the one and got married and settled down. And she says her captor robbed her of that. Now, in the early summer of 2002, Elizabeth was 14 years old and was looking forward to starting high school and all the milestones that come along with that, such as getting her driver's license and having a little bit more freedom, and, of course, boys. Now, Elizabeth's family was Mormon, and of course, this meant that she grew up in a home with strong family values and relatively strict moral values as well.
Right.
And Elizabeth loved being a part of her church community and was said to have a lot of friends within the church, as well as a close relationship with her family, her parents, and her siblings.
Right.
Now, early June 2002, this was a rough time for the Smart family. Elizabeth's grandfather had been diagnosed with an aggressive brain tumor and passed away just 2 months later. And the night before Elizabeth was kidnapped was a busy night for the family and one of many mixed emotions. So they had just had the funeral for Lois's father, which is Elizabeth's grandfather. And meanwhile, that night was to be an end of year award ceremony at Elizabeth's school, and Elizabeth was to be playing the harp.
Oh,
Now, Ed and Lois were doing their best to stay in good spirits, and Lois, as mothers do, was wearing several hats at once, trying to figure out the logistics of the evening, get everybody where they needed to be, figure out how to get the harp in the car,
right.
and meanwhile, also cook dinner. And amidst all this stress, she winds up burning the meal. So she cracked a window in the kitchen to air out some of the smoke.
Girl, I felt that.
Yeah. Now, that's gonna be important in just a minute.
Unfortunately, I felt it would be. I just need,
Yeah.
like, shout out, you're not the first. Like, we've
You're not the
all done it.
first.
As a
We've
matter of
all
fact, I did it like a couple months ago, and John the other day, he was just like, "Hey, is did you like open the window?" I was like 2 months ago when we burnt that thing, and he's like, "Oh my god!" Like, no wonder our electric bill is so high. So. Not the first mom and not the last to open a window and leave it open to air out. And
once again,
definitely
we cite LJ's lack of self-preservation.
okay, but I didn't realize it didn't get shut. I thought that was a John job.
It does honestly sound like a John job, to be fair.
Thank you. Thank you.
Honestly, he should be checking the windows and doors every night. That's his he
Thank
should
you.
add
Thank
that
you.
add that to his chore list.
Why should that be my job? Closing the window I opened? I think not. Hate
Absolutely.
myself. God.
Who does he think he is? Anyways, so she cracks the window to air out the smoke, and the family proceeds to have dinner, and everyone rushes out the door to the school, and they arrive late. And Lois is on edge as nothing is going according to plan. But, they get through the evening and they arrive at home. And after arriving at home, Elizabeth and her sister Mary Catherine proceed up to their shared room, where together they read from the book Ella Enchanted before drifting off to sleep.
So sweet.
Super sweet. This is where it gets less sweet.
Oh.
So, in the wee hours of the morning of June 5th, 2002, Elizabeth woke up to hear an unfamiliar voice, which she initially thought must be part of a strange dream. As she opened her eyes, however, she saw a man standing over her bed and heard him say, "I have a knife at your neck. Don't make a sound. Get up and come with me."
God, that would be any person's nightmare, but to be a
And
child?
yeah, that had to be terrible. So she could feel the knife at her neck, and immediately Elizabeth thought of her sister sleeping there in the same room with her. And she thought that if she didn't comply with this man, he might take her sister, and she knew she had to go.
Oh, what a good sissy. I mean, terrible, but just as a mom of sisters, like because I have
Yeah.
two girls, I'm like, oh my god, either of my girls I could see doing that. It breaks my heart, but like as a mom, like oh my god,
I could see B doing
oh,
that. Like, don't even want to
yeah,
think about it, but I could see her doing that.
exactly. It's just like being in a position where I have two girls of my own, I just like can't help but to
Picture
you
it as your
know
yeah.
Yeah, it's oh my god. Alright, keep going. These are so hard.
Yeah.
Cases with kids.
I know. So he replied sorry. So she thought that he might take her sister. She knew she had to go. So he walked her over to her closet to get a pair of shoes. And Elizabeth asked him, "Why are you doing this?" And he replied that he was taking her to hold for ransom. He then proceeded to walk her out of the room and down the hallway. And the man whispered to Elizabeth, "If you scream or yell, I'll kill your family or I'll kill you." And at that point, you know, although Elizabeth did fear that he may have already killed some of her family, she chose to comply as, it seemed to be her best chance at survival for not only herself, but her family,
Mhm.
to whom, she was very close with. So Elizabeth said that as her captor, she later would say that as her captor led her through the family home, she silently prayed for her parents to wake up and save her. But sadly, they remained asleep as she was led right out of the home.
So funny.
He led her down the stairs through the kitchen and out the back door of the Smart family home. And then back in the house, as it turned out, Mary Catherine was actually awake the entire time.
Oh,
How
wow.
Yeah, so she saw everything, but she knew that revealing that fact would put them both at risk. So these girls, they're described as sheltered and naive, but really this is smart.
Right. And I mean, you can tell that, like, regardless of being sheltered, Definitely
Yeah.
that just instinctual self-preservation, like, those survival instincts are innate, you know?
Yeah, for sure. So she pretended to be asleep. And once she couldn't hear them in the house anymore, she got out of bed to go tell her parents what had happened. And meanwhile, now I should point out that Mary Catherine was rightfully terrified. And it did take her a while to get out of bed and go tell her parents.
I would imagine, yeah.
Yeah, she approached the bedroom door a few times, but kind of thought she heard something, went back to bed. She did wait a little while to make sure that they were out of the house.
Right.
And which, is totally justified in this case.
Absolutely.
So she jumps out of bed to go tell her parents what had happened. Now, meanwhile, again, Elizabeth is out of the house at this point, and she was led to an empty lot of sorts. It was at this point that her captor noticed some headlights coming towards them. And Elizabeth would later recall him saying, "If this work is true, God, let this car pass."
Oh, that, like, gave me chills.
She would go on to say, quote, "I was being kidnapped, but here he was mentioning God. It didn't make any sense."
Right.
So that brings me to her captor. I just want to touch on him for a minute before we get too far into this. So Elizabeth's captor, as we know now, was a man called Brian David Mitchell. Now, a little background on him. Brian was born in Salt Lake City in 1953 to Cheryl and Irene Mitchell.
Mhm.
Now, he, like Elizabeth, also came from a Mormon family and was one of 6 children. He was particularly interested in the Smart family because of their faith, and it's said that he specifically was looking to target someone within the Mormon faith, as he would be very familiar with their mindset and beliefs, and he would know exactly how to manipulate them to get his desired result.
Right.
Now, despite being from the same faith, Brian's upbringing was quite the opposite of the Smart children, and while his mother, Irene, was said to be a good and caring mother, his father, Cheryl, was a fucking weirdo, okay? Oddly enough, he was a social worker, but he was a lunatic. So he would drop Brian off in an unfamiliar area and force him to find his way home. And he taught Brian all the nitty gritty details of sex when he was just 8 years old.
Oh, I don't love
Yeah. He forced him to look at graphic images in medical journals. And it's said that as a teen, Brian became extremely rebellious and was actually sent to juvie for exposing himself to a much younger girl when he was 16.
Ew.
So he's been a weirdo for a while.
Yeah.
Now, upon his release, he was sent to live with his grandmother, but it's said that that didn't do much in terms of correcting his behavior. And he eventually dropped out of high school and stayed away from the faith in which he was raised and began drinking and getting into drugs. And when he was 19, he married a 16-year-old, ironically named Karen Miner.
Oh
And
my god. That's on the news.
yeah. And I shouldn't be laughing at that, but
No, I mean, it's just the
the irony for me.
yes,
Yeah.
and not the situation.
And they had 2 children together. So they were married for just 2 years. And when they divorced, Brian actually got custody of the kids. Now, Karen did eventually remarry, and at that time, she attempted to regain custody of her children.
Mhm.
Now, Brian took the kids and fled to New Hampshire, and it's said that Karen didn't really go to much additional effort to get her kids back after that. Brian lived in New Hampshire with the children for 2 years, part of the time staying in a Hare Krishna commune before returning to Salt Lake City. Now, when he arrived back in Salt Lake City, his brother, who had just returned from a mission, convinced Brian to rejoin the Mormon church. Now, he once again became active in the church, and then in 1981, he married his second wife, Debbie, who already had 3 children.
Mhm.
So, they had her 3, his 2, and then they had 2 more kids together,
Right.
totaling 7 kids in the household. Now, soon after their marriage became strained very quickly.
Right.
And at this point, believing that they were threatening his marriage, Brian placed his 2 children from his first marriage into foster care. Now, it should also be noted that while residing in his home, Brian refused to let the 2 oldest children attend the LDS church, as he believed they were not worthy. Additionally, he insisted that the children be adopted by a non-Mormon family and that they not be allowed to have any contact with his extended family.
Can I just point out that Brian's unworthy?
Yeah, well, that's the understatement of the year, fam.
Just saying. But go on.
Okay, now, prior to placing the kids into foster care, Brian was made to undergo a psychiatric evaluation. Now, the psychiatrist found no signs of mental illness.
Okay.
I'm going to say that again. Found no signs of mental illness.
So is it like he's not mentally ill, he's just a piece of shit?
I mean, I feel like he has to be some level of mentally ill to do what he did. What we're going to read. I don't think he's, mentally ill to the point of being absolved of guilt.
Right.
But I mean, there's got to be something going on upstairs in the coconut for you to act like this. I don't know, but I'm not a professional, so.
Right.
Now, shortly after all of this, it said that Brian became obsessed with Satan. And when questioned about this, he would claim that he was just learning about his enemy. Brian filed for divorce from Debbie in 1984, claiming that she was violent with him and the kids. But yet the kids all remained with her. Interesting, right? So, a year after their separation, Debbie reported to the authorities that she believed Brian may have sexually abused their 3-year-old son. And they couldn't find any solid proof of these allegations, but a caseworker did recommend that all future visitations be supervised.
Right.
And later, Brian's stepdaughter came forward saying that he had sexually abused her the entire time that he was married to her mom.
Oh, poor honey.
Yeah. So, allegedly, Debbie brought this to the attention of church leaders.
Right.
But they were advised to just, let it go.
Brush it under the rug.
Which, I mean, checks out for the LDS church. I'm not gonna lie. Like, I'm not an expert, but from everything I've heard about, the LDS church and its leaders, that doesn't surprise
Not
me.
shocking, yeah.
So, now the same day that his divorce from Debbie was finalized, Brian married his 3rd wife, Wanda Barzy. And she had 6 children, but had left them all with her ex-husband when she married Brian.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a few of them did move in with the couple for a short period of time, but quickly grew tired of Brian's preaching and moved back out. Brian began to portray Satan during temple rituals, and it got to the point where other church members were like really uncomfortable, and he was eventually asked to tone it down. He changed his name to Emmanuel David Isaiah and told everyone that he was a prophet of God and that he received prophetic visions.
But that's how it always starts, Brian. Emmanuel,
Yeah.
Israel, Isaiah, Moses. Like, what is going on here?
So Brian's wife, Wanda, began going by the name of Hephzibah. And Brian started preaching and begging for money on the streets of Salt Lake City. Just 2 months before the abduction, he wrote a 27-page prophecy titled The Book of Emmanuel David Isaiah. Now, this prophecy allegedly instructed Brian to gather 50 virgin brides to help him get God's house in order before the apocalypse. When the leaders of the Mormon church caught wind of Brian's prophecy, he was excommunicated. And in April of 2002, Brian's own mother filed a restraining order against both he and his wife after they allegedly showed up at her home aggressively, trying to get her to read his book of Emmanuel David Isaiah.
Right.
So that's pretty much the events leading, not all of the events leading up to the kidnapping, but that's just a background on Brian and his fucking insanity.
Boy was unhinged,
He
basically.
was unhinged. So that leads us back to, again, the night of the kidnapping. Brian's led Elizabeth to this empty lot. He's rambling on about God. Now, Brian, as this car passes, Brian kept repeating, "If you move, I'll kill you. If you move, I'll kill you." Now, as it turns out, the passing car was a police car.
Oh my
But
god.
yeah, and that's going to be a common theme in this story, is that there was just so many times that this girl was so close to being rescued. It's ridiculous. I've never heard anything like this story. So it was a police car, but unfortunately, Brian got his wish and it passed by them.
Right. Oh.
Now, as soon as the police car had passed, they were up and running, and Brian always was right behind Elizabeth with a knife to her back. Elizabeth
Right.
kept looking for opportunities to run, but there was no way out at this point. Now, at one point, Elizabeth actually said to him, "If you're just going to rape and kill me, please do it here."
And just for clarification, because you might have said this earlier, but what was her age at this time?
She was 14.
Okay, okay. I was thinking that we were around there. I just wasn't positive.
Yeah. So Brian gave Elizabeth a smile she would later describe as bone chilling and say, "I'm not going to rape and murder you yet."
Ooh,
Yeah.
vile.
It is. It's disturbing shit. Now, Elizabeth would later go on to say in an interview that in her mind, she wanted her parents to know what happened to her. And
Right,
she wanted them to find her even if it was just her body.
right,
And that was, her reasoning behind saying, "Just kill me here."
right.
Now, meanwhile, back at the Smart House, Mary Catherine has woken up her parents saying somebody's taken Elizabeth. And her
Mhm.
parents, of course, are startled. And they woke up assuming their daughter must have had a bad dream. Her
Right.
parent,
I'm sure you wake up and you're like, I'm
yeah.
sorry, what? Like, go back to bed. But also,
You're
like, I
like,
want to check this out.
what? Some
But like,
creeper broke into our giant house in this bougie neighborhood? That's not a thing that happens. What are you,
yeah.
Gaga?
I mean, you're definitely gonna get up and check things out, but I'm sure your first thought would be like, oh, like she had a nightmare, like, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like,
I mean, especially because, like, kids say all kinds of shit. Like,
oh, can confirm.
oh my God, some of the shit that your kids say sometimes. That was exactly, you know what? Was when I said that, I thought of RL. And I
Oh
was
yeah.
like, it just some of the shit she comes up with.
Oh yeah. I mean, just today the girls were playing 20 questions at lunch and we went through like normal questions. Is your character a princess? Yes. Is it, a Disney or Pixar? Oh, it's Disney. And then RL goes, is the person gluten free? And she's literally 6, and none of us are gluten free. And then my older kiddo, B, she's like, "What?" She was like, "Why would I know if they're gluten free? I mean, probably not." Anyway, kids say some weird
Yeah.
shit. Just like,
Yeah.
what?
No, they have
Oh,
they have a wild imagination, so they're probably like, okay, let's get to the bottom of this. So
right.
her parents, of course, are thinking this can't be happening. She must be in the house someplace. And they begin frantically searching the home, waking up the other kids, like, "Hey, is Elizabeth in here?" So on and so forth. And as Ed searches the home, Mary Catherine says once again to her father, "Someone has taken her. You're not going to find her."
Right.
And
Like,
right about then, Lois joins her husband downstairs in the kitchen, turns on the lights, and notices the window that she had let open to let the smoke out.
that poor mother.
Yeah, seriously. she must be feeling awful. So she saw the screen had been cut and told her husband, Ed, we need to call the police.
Right.
After contacting police, Ed picked up the phone and began calling friends, family, anybody he could think of to come help. And that's going to be important soon.
Right.
Because this is where this case gets kind of really mishandled. So, meanwhile, Elizabeth is bargaining with her captor. She's telling him things like, my parents will pay anything to get me back. If you get caught, you'll spend the rest of your life in prison. If you just let me go, my parents won't press charges, so on and so forth.
Right. Definitely like the bartering.
Yeah. And at this point, Brian looks at Elizabeth with the same smile as before and says, I know what I'm doing and I know what the consequences are. The only difference is I'm not going to get caught.
Mm.
So, 2 police officers arrive to the home. The problem is that these jackasses didn't secure the crime scene.
Right.
And within minutes, everybody and their brother is swarming around the Smart family home. One detective would later say in a documentary, I had never seen a crime scene so contaminated.
Oh,
Yeah.
God.
One mistake by rookie officers destroyed any hope of finding any evidence as to what happened to Elizabeth that night. And Mary Catherine was the only person to see the suspect, and she was able to provide some description to police, but ultimately there just wasn't a whole lot to go off of. And the only witness is a traumatized kid.
And do we know how old the sister would have been?
You know what? Let me. I do. I'm sure it was mentioned 1,000 times, but I did not bother to put it in my notes.
Okay.
So let me do. You know what? We're gonna just do a Goog real quick.
Okay, that sounds like a plan because I'm just like really curious to know because these just seem like such brilliant girls, like to have this much thought.
Okay, so she was 5 years younger than Elizabeth, so she would have been around 9 or so.
Okay.
Yeah, no, they're smart girls. Like, honestly, it's probably the only reason that she survived this. Was just, sheer, I don't know.
Just how they responded to the situation. Anybody
Yeah,
could have responded differently and
absolutely.
not come out the way that she did.
Absolutely. So, finally, after the crime scene is already horribly contaminated, the police are like, well, hey, you can't have all these people in here.
Mhm.
Which, of course, at this point isn't worth much. But after this, they realize they do need to get everybody out of the house, figure out who they are, and get their fingerprints so they can try to clean up this mess they've created.
Right.
And at this point, the family also needs to be cleared as possible suspects in the case. Now, the
Right.
immediate family were placed in separate police cars and taken to the police station for questioning. Lois did later mention being irritated with this process and especially concerned for Mary Catherine as she was only 9 years old and the only witness to the horrendous crime and now separated from the rest of her family.
That would just be trauma on trauma at that point.
Yeah. So police also bring cadaver dogs in to search the family's property just in case.
Mhm.
Now, back with Elizabeth and fucking psycho ass over here. At this point, the sun is starting to come up, and Elizabeth actually recognized her captor. Her family had first encountered Brian Mitchell when Elizabeth and her siblings were out with her mother and they came across a man who was looking for work. Now, soon after that, he did come and do some work around the house for her father. He later would say that the very first time he saw her was with her mom. Sorry, the very first time he saw her with her mom, he knew she was the one he wanted.
That's so disturbing. And this family
So
is
disturbing.
trying to be
Yeah.
like, you know,
Yeah.
upstanding members of the community is like trying to get him work and
Yeah. So Lois and all the kids were out, I guess, shopping. Um,
right.
and they came across this guy, and Lois, I guess, he had like a sign that he was looking for work. And Lois gave him $5 and said, hey, my husband probably has some things that need done around the house. He came and worked for the family. He came
Right.
one time, never came back until the day of the kidnapping. It said that he actually did return to the smart home several times prior to the kidnapping to scout the best route and the layout of the home and the area. Now, as they make their way over the mountain, Brian tells Elizabeth that his wife is waiting for them. And at this time, Elizabeth begins to think that maybe he kidnapped her because they can't have kids.
Right.
Maybe they want her to be their daughter. And she's kind of thinking, okay, well, if that's the case, at least I get to live.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So as they approach the secret camp, so to speak, Brian yelled out, Hepzibah! And
Oh
Elizabeth,
my God.
it's so
I
corny.
hate it. But
I
go
hate it.
on.
And Elizabeth heard a woman's voice yell back, Emmanuel!
What the fuck?
I literally hate this part.
These absolute Fruit Loops of
It's like nails on a
people.
chalkboard. I hate that part. So,
Cringy as hell.
honest to God. Fucking Hepzibah.
Ishmael, Emmanuel, David, Moses, Jebediah. Get out of here.
LG's just rattling off every name in the Bible.
Literally.
I'm sure.
Grab your Bible and go to therapy. You're not okay.
God.
Okay.
Way
I
to
got
use your
that out of my system.
way to use your Catholic school education.
Thanks. I knew it would come in handy sometime.
God. So they approach the camp and Elizabeth can see a tent and a woman she described as looking scary. Now, the woman began to hug Elizabeth, although the hug was anything but comforting, and she led her into a tent and set her down on a bucket. She began to wash her feet and proceeded to try and undress her.
No, ma'am.
Elizabeth begged and pleaded with her not to take her clothes off, and eventually the woman was like, fine, here, put this robe on, And at one point, she even threatened Elizabeth and said that if she didn't allow the woman to remove her clothes, she'd have Emmanuel come in and do it. Shortly after this, Brian enters the tent where Elizabeth is waiting, and he performs some sort of marriage ritual and tells Elizabeth that she's now his wife.
Wow, that sounds very official. Good job. Good job.
Super official. And he tells her that it's now time to consummate the marriage.
No, ma'am.
Yeah. So, obviously, at this point, Elizabeth is terrified. She's 14 years old. And on top of that, she's Mormon, and her virginity is extremely important to her.
Sure.
Yeah. So, she once again begins to try and reason with her attacker. And at one point, she even exclaims, I haven't even started my period yet.
Right.
And Brian shouts out, Jesus Christ, I hate this. I hate even having to read this quote, but we do this for you guys. Brian shouts out, Hepzibah, is it okay that she hasn't started her period yet? And
Hepzibah, give a reasonable answer here.
To which his wife replied, it's fine.
Come on, Hepzibah. Come
Literally.
on. Get the fuck out of here, Heppy.
Jesus Christ.
I laugh to get through this, but honestly. Go on.
So later, actually, in an interview, Elizabeth said, I thought you had to face each other to have sex. So she believed that if she rolled over and crossed her legs, he wouldn't be able to get to her.
Oh, honey.
Yeah, again, this is, she's a 14-year-old Mormon girl. So after he raped her, Brian got up and walked out of the tent, leaving Elizabeth lying there, feeling what she would later describe as truly broken.
Right.
Like there was no coming back. She said she truly believed it would be better if she were dead. Now, at this point, Elizabeth decides she's going to get some sleep, and unfortunately, when she woke up, she found Brian attaching a metal cable to her ankle. Although she had every intention of running away that night, she assured Brian that she wouldn't run, begging him not to chain her up, but of course it was to no avail. And at this point, Elizabeth realized that they had no intentions of killing her, but rather keeping her as their prisoner.
Ugh.
Now, so back at home, Elizabeth's family is doing everything they can. They're trying to appeal to the public. They're making, statements on television. They're plastering her photos everywhere. And volunteers are searching for Elizabeth day and night.
Right.
Now, by the end of the next day, there were over 2,000 volunteers.
Oh my God.
And on the third day after the abduction, Ed Smart, he could not take it anymore, and he had a total breakdown. And he was actually admitted to the hospital. Now, after a talk with his bishop, he did return home.
Summer is finally here, but camping? It's canceled. If you enjoy true crime podcasts, check out Camping is Canceled wherever you stream your podcasts. Jen and Kate host the show, and we love listening to their case coverages because listening to them is like sitting down by a campfire with your besties and sharing chilling stories, but without the potential hazards, collateral damage, or run-in with questionable characters. Their cases are also informative and maintain a great deal of respect for their victims that the cases cover. If you want to get your summer on, be sure to check out Camping is Canceled. Shout out Jen and Kate.
Meanwhile, on the third day, Elizabeth was sitting in her new prison where she heard a familiar voice calling her name. And she couldn't pinpoint the voice, but she felt like it was someone she knew. She began to think, oh, they're going to find me. Great,
Right.
Until Brian once again held a knife to her and threatened to kill her if she screamed and kill anyone who entered the camp.
Right.
After that, Elizabeth never heard her name being called again.
Oh.
There were bloodhounds, helicopters, and search parties. And Elizabeth later said she could hear the helicopters hovering right over the camp.
Mm.
And when the day came that she could no longer hear the choppers, she assumed she had been forgotten about.
That's so sad.
I mean, they were right there. They were so close.
Right.
I think that's the most unique and heartbreaking and frustrating all at once part of this story
Right.
is how many times they were so goddamn close.
Right.
And there's more. So the police began to take a hard look at the family, actually, and one uncle failed a polygraph test. Now, reports were saying that the screen looked as though it had been cut from the inside. 12 computers were seized from the family.
Right.
So they're really looking into the family, and all this time, she's with Brian in the fucking woods.
Right.
And, the media plays a huge role in this case too, because they're reporting all this stuff that, oh, well, now we're looking at the family. Well, meanwhile, Elizabeth's chained to a fucking tree somewhere.
Right.
At one point, back at the camp, Brian brought wine back to the camp, and of course, Elizabeth declined, being Mormon and being 14.
Sure.
He eventually forced her to drink the wine, telling her no food or water until you drink this. He forced Elizabeth to drink glass after glass of wine, and then he would rape her. And this became a common theme in Elizabeth's daily life for the duration of her captivity. Now, as the investigation continues, Elizabeth's family continues with the TV appearances, and police, of course, have gotten a list of anybody that's worked in the Smart home. Now, it was said they had upwards of 60 different contractors that had done work on the home at different times.
Right.
Now, investigators began to look at Richard Reese. He had worked as a handyman in the Smart home, and he had a long criminal history. He was effectively a career criminal.
Right.
The family was sure that he must have had something to do with Elizabeth's disappearance. And allegedly he had, his criminal record was like, he had shot at a police officer during a robbery, and he was said to be very dangerous. It was also said that he had stolen jewelry from the Smart family when he worked for them. Now, Richard's wife said he was home sleeping all night, and he did pass a polygraph. At this point, Richard is still being zeroed in on here. despite there being no real evidence linking him to this crime.
Right.
And again, we come back to this. It's frustrating because Elizabeth is chained to a fucking tree in the woods and you're dicking around.
Right.
I mean, yeah, the guy has a criminal record. He doesn't have the strongest alibi, but you have no evidence.
Right. And I mean, we also have a contaminated crime scene as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's just this whole case is just like makes you just want to like strangle somebody. So at one point, the family is sitting watching TV, and Richard Reese pops up on the television. And Mary Catherine, who remember is the only witness to the kidnapping, was like, "Yeah, that's not him.
Right. So that should like carry some merit.
That should carry some merit." Now, back at the prison camp, Elizabeth was forbidden to speak of her family. But one day, Brian was talking about his own mother and where she lived, and Elizabeth was, without thinking, was like, "Oh, my cousin lives near there."
Hmm.
Now, she noted that Brian didn't get mad, and that was unusual because usually he would get upset when she would talk about her family. And
Right.
later he comes to her and says, "I've had revelation and you're not going to like it." He proceeds to tell Elizabeth that the Lord has commanded him to kidnap her cousin Olivia to be his
Oh,
next wife.
honey, no.
Yeah, so Brian did attempt to kidnap Olivia, but he was thankfully unsuccessful.
Good.
He cut the window screen and attempted to break into the home, much like he did with Elizabeth's home. However, he knocked over some picture frames and woke up Olivia's sister, and that was enough to scare him off.
Yeah.
Olivia later recalled waking up to the sound of her father on the phone with the police saying, "Someone just tried to break into our house and were related to Elizabeth Smart."
Right.
Now, Ed also contacted the police department and they agreed to look into it, but the matter was brushed off as being insignificant to Elizabeth's case. This attempted break in also further proves the fact that Richard Reese wasn't involved in Elizabeth's abduction.
Right.
He was incarcerated at the time of this incident.
Oh my god.
So Elizabeth's brother took the attempted kidnapping of his cousin to mean that Elizabeth still may be alive.
Right.
And her family's like pushing law enforcement, like, "Hey, we need to look into this." But once again, the Salt Lake City police are being useless.
Useless.
So fast forward a little bit. After about 6 weeks, tethered to trees, Brian actually took Elizabeth down into Salt Lake City.
Mm.
He would force her to wear a veil and told her if she'd speak, he'd kill her and her family. This became a regular occurrence.
Right.
So again, she's so fucking close. At one point, Elizabeth even ended up at a house party where one attendee even told her, like, "Hey, you need to ditch this guy. He's trouble." But he said Elizabeth just looked scared and lost. And he later said he felt bad, but he didn't think it was his place to do anything other than advise her to leave.
Right.
In August of 2002, so that we're like 2-ish months into this now, Salt Lake City police, received a call from the local public library saying that Elizabeth Smart was there at the library. Now, at this point, on this day, Mitchell and Barzy and Elizabeth are all sitting at a table in the library and they're talking about moving to California because winter is coming soon.
Mm-hmm.
And they're wanting to go someplace warmer. Now, at this point, a detective actually approaches the table and he's asking to see Elizabeth's face. Now, he doesn't mention Elizabeth's name, but they say there's a girl missing, and if I can just see her face to prove it's not her, we'll be on our way. Now,
Right.
at this point, Elizabeth is effectively brainwashed. He's told her so many times, "If you speak, I'll kill you. I'll kill your family," that
Sure.
she genuinely believed it. And after the detective leaves, the three of them hightail it out of the library, and Brian's like, "We need to move out of Utah."
Right.
So, again, this is just another example. I mean, she literally talked to a cop.
Right.
And, well, I'm sorry, I don't know if she actually spoke, but there was
There was a
literally
cop in her
there was a
presence.
cop right there.
Yeah.
And honestly, I don't know. I kind of have to say shame on the cop. Like, I
No,
get that. Sorry, go ahead.
no, you're fine. I get what you're saying though, because not to go off on too far of a tangent, but I think that this gives like, firsthand experience as to why victims don't speak up or can't speak up in these situations. Without going into too much detail, I mean, I went to one of those troubled teen, fix your kid type camps for over 2 years. It was extremely, extremely, extremely abusive, psychologically, physically, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And I was sitting in a room with CPS. These CPS workers were begging me to tell them that I was abused. Essentially, like, are you fed? Are you this? Are you that? I could not tell them because in my head, I'm sitting there. The people who are abusing me, this is their trailer, and as far
Right.
as I know, I'm like, there could be like this could be audio recorded, this could be a test, this could be whatever. I'm like, I would not have spoken up unless you had taken me out of the environment, completely away from the people, taken me down somewhere completely safe and secure, showed me your documentation, like proven to me who you are and that I'm not in direct harm for saying something. And even then, would I have said something? I don't know because I would have been
Yeah.
so scared of ramifications. And this is not a situation where I was being, threatened with a knife to my neck either. So I can only imagine for this poor girl.
Right. And the thing is, the cop said, well, I can't, of course, he told her that the veil was for religious reasons,
Sure.
you know, and the cop says, he later said that, I can't go on ripping veils off of women, all across the city. And I get it, but at the same time, you know,
Can I see some ID?
yeah,
Can
I just feel like he could have done something else.
Yeah.
I don't think that's a valid argument because I don't know a lot about religions that cover their face and their hair, but from what I know, they all, are happy to show their face to a law enforcement.
Well, and here's the thing too. Going back to what I said a moment ago, why would this cop sitting with somebody who he suspects is an abducted child
Yeah.
who has been abducted, I'm sure, with force, you would have to imagine, to get a child to comply like that with force, with threats, with whatever. God only
Yeah.
knows what Elizabeth would have been through at this point, to his knowledge, if this was in fact Elizabeth. Bare minimum, what should have happened here is separate her from the potential abuser and get her direct input. Tell the people, you sit here, I'm taking her.
Yeah.
If you have to have another officer come up so that you can have one sit with the that's what you do. But
Absolutely. Like, call for backup, like, do
yeah,
something.
absolutely.
I just think it was extremely mishandled. So,
Absolutely.
after again, the detective leaves, they're like, we got to get the hell out of Utah. So, for several weeks, Brian leaves Elizabeth with his wife while he goes out and panhandles. And they eventually scrape up enough money to purchase the three of them bus tickets to San Diego. And now at this point, months have gone by and police have no credible leads. They had thousands of shitty leads, but nothing solid.
Right.
And several times bodies were found, and Elizabeth's family wondered if it was her. And additionally, at this time, the police are back on Reese. However, Reese was at this point incarcerated, and on August 27th, 2002, he suffered a brain hemorrhage and slipped into a coma. On August 30th, he passed away. And at this point, they're kind of like, well, fuck, we just wasted a lot of time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Been
So,
there.
literally, like, this is ridiculous. It just, this whole case just makes me want to do things to people that I can't say on the pod. Eat it here. So, Elizabeth and her captors arrived in California, and the cycle continues, of the alcohol abuse and being raped and being starved and tortured and tied up and, so on and so forth. So, fast forward to October, and Mary Catherine is racking her brain trying to think of what happened, who took Elizabeth.
Mhm.
And she said as she was lying in her bed one night, the name Emmanuel came to mind. And she told her dad, I think I know who did it. And she told him that it was the homeless guy that came and helped work on the roof. Now, at this point, a lot of the police, they don't believe this. They're still stuck on Reese. And they believe Elizabeth to be dead. They
Right.
even went so far as to tell the Smart family to hold a memorial service.
Oh,
Now, the whole time they're saying, hey, let's not talk about this Emmanuel in the media. We don't want to alert him.
right.
And eventually, the Smart family had enough of being dismissed and they released the
Yeah,
information about Emmanuel. Within 2 weeks, they had a lead.
good for
So,
them.
yeah, so this actually reached the attention of Brian's brother in law, Tom, and his wife, Lisa, Brian's sister. And they saw an article and they were like, well, shit, that sounds like Brian. And so Lisa calls the police and she's like, hey, I know who this is. So meanwhile, Brian, Wanda, and Elizabeth are out in California. They're pretty much living the same way that they did in Salt Lake City. And on one particular occasion, Brian left to go into the city to minister, quote.
God.
And yeah, I hate that, right? And he left Elizabeth and Wanda with no food or water, as he often did. Only this time he actually broke into a church and was arrested, leaving them to nearly starve to death. At one point, it began raining, and they caught rainwater in tarps in order to not thirst to death. He eventually came back with some leftover KFC and bragged about how the police ran his fingerprints and nothing came up, and how he had given them a fake name.
Ridiculous.
Fam, it's so ridiculous. So things are starting to come together and things are pointing to Brian David Mitchell, but police still are not convinced.
Right.
So Mick Finnerty, who is an FBI chief investigator on the case, gave a copy of the photo of Brian to the media unit and they sent it to America's Most Wanted.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and after seeing him on America's Most Wanted, Mitchell's ex-wife, Debbie, calls into the tip line and she's like, that's my husband. He's a street preacher. He's a con artist, and he molested my daughter, and he's married to another psycho, and her name is Wanda Bardsey.
Good job, Debbie.
Yay! 5 stars, Debbie. We love a Debbie.
Way to turn out, Deb. We love you for that.
Yeah, it's not your fault you married a psycho. So Mitchell is thinking it's time for him to move again, and he's rattling off ideas like New York, so on and so forth. And Elizabeth, again, smart girl, she starts thinking, I've got to convince him to go back to Salt Lake.
Right.
So Elizabeth starts to wise up a little and she kind of fools Brian at his own game. And she says, I just have this feeling we're supposed to go back to Salt Lake. And I know God would never talk to me, but can you ask God if we're supposed to go back there? Surely he'd tell you you're his prophet.
Oh my God. This
And
girl.
she's smart. I mean, I got to
She
give it to
is
her. She's
smart.
brainwashed, but
Yeah.
she's smart. And Brian's like, oh, yeah, And so Elizabeth proceeds to tell him that she thinks it's important for her to experience hitchhiking. So they bought her a wig and sunglasses and they're off. And now It did prove to be hard to get rides, and Elizabeth starts to think like, shit, maybe I fucked up, right?
Right.
But, eventually they do take a bus into Salt Lake City. Now,
Right.
on March 12th, 2003, the Salt Lake Tribune published a story saying that the Smarts were frustrated with the police's lack of progress and that they were ignoring the best lead in the case, Brian David Mitchell, because they were too hung up on Richard Reese.
Right. The dead man.
Yeah, the dead man. Now, okay, so they're taking the bus into Salt Lake City, and the young man starts to question Brian about Elizabeth, asking why she's wearing a wig, so on and so forth. So, Brian, of course, doesn't like this, and he quickly gets them off the bus. Now,
Right.
as they're walking up the street, a call comes into 911, and the caller says, "Hey, I think I see this Emmanuel guy, and he's got two women with him."
Mm,
So they're walking down the street, and like a shit ton of cops pull up.
yeah.
And Brian introduces himself as Peter Marshall. And he said that they've given up all earthly possessions and that they were just servants of the Lord. So they had no ID, etc., And at this point, one of the officers noticed that one of the females accompanying him resembled Elizabeth Smart. Brian is telling the cops, "This is my daughter. You're not allowed to talk to her," so on and so forth. So the police pull Elizabeth to the side to question her.
Good job pulling aside.
Finally, we have a cop with two fucking brain cells to rub together.
Love that. Way
So,
overdue.
yeah. And yeah, literally, she was kidnapped in what, June of 2002? This is now March of 2003, for Christ's sakes.
Ridiculous.
So police, they pull her aside to question her, and initially she gives the bullshit story that Brian told her to give, that she was raised in Florida by her mother,
Mm-hmm.
and she had just come to be with her father and stepmother this past year. And the police aren't buying it. They produce a flyer with Elizabeth's photo on it, and they're like, "That's her. That's her." So the police tell her, "It's over. You're safe. Just say you're Elizabeth Smart. That's all you have to do."
Right.
And she proceeds to deny that she is Elizabeth for about 45 minutes, still fearing the wrath of her captors.
Oh.
And finally, as the police handcuffed her and led her to the back of a cruiser, they said, "All right, this is your last chance to tell us that you're Elizabeth Smart." To which she replied simply, "Thou sayest."
Oh my God. I feel like that alone says
Yeah, well, because for like 9 months,
so
she's been speaking in biblical fucking terms.
right.
So that's what she said. She said, "Thou sayest."
Right.
And as she sits in the back of the patrol car, Elizabeth is still terrified that she's going to be killed. And
Mm.
as she sat in the police interrogation room, the door burst open without warning, and there was her dad.
Oh.
And she said, as her father ran over and hugged her, she finally felt safe.
Oh, that almost made me cry. I
I
almost had a
know. I almost
feeling.
had a feeling. Jesus Christ.
Oh.
Elizabeth was welcomed home by extended and immediate family, and soon offers of treatment began to flood in. And people said that she needed to be sent off to treatment and that she needed to be removed from society to heal. But
Girl, no.
for the past 9 months, Elizabeth didn't have a say in anything. So it was really important to her that her wishes be respected, and she wanted to be home with her family.
Yeah.
And she would later go on to remark that her parents respecting that wish was hugely empowering for her.
Good.
Now, authorities began to interrogate Brian, and every time they got close to a confession, Brian would go on one of his fucking psychotic rants. And
Sounds
the
right.
police believed that he was faking insanity. Now, it took about 8 years from the time Elizabeth was rescued for this case to come to court. And in the meantime, the Smart family is dodging the media. They don't want anything to jeopardize the case.
Right.
As one would presume with this case, the mental status of the defendants was called into question.
Right.
And they were remanded to mental hospitals until 2010, when they were finally deemed fit to stand trial. Now, As the trial draws closer, Lois Smart is concerned that her daughter isn't ready to take the stand and face her captors and be grilled about why she didn't run away. And ultimately, Elizabeth said that she was nervous walking into court. However, she said when she saw him in shackles, she realized that he didn't have power over her anymore.
Right.
And
And I
it
would
was,
also argue, like, how would anybody ever truly be, like, ready for that? You know
yeah,
what I mean? But good for her that she got to have that, you
moment.
know, moment of, like, I'm safe,
Moment of fuck
her
you, you
people. Yeah,
lunatic.
absolutely.
Yeah, so it was said that she was an exceptional witness and she would later be credited as the main reason for the guilty verdict in this case.
Good.
Ultimately, the result, Brian David Mitchell will serve life in prison.
I wish the
Hepzibah,
death penalty were on the table almost.
Hepzibah, on the other fucking hand, was released in 2018.
Why? And this is okay. Hear me out. This might be a controversial opinion, but I was listening to another podcast the other day. I can't remember if it was Morbid or if it was Crime Junkie. Whatever the case, they had referenced some other source and they were talking about cases like this, right? Where women who are victims of abuse help recruit other young women to kind of take their place in the chain of abuse.
Mm-hmm.
And it essentially said, that that woman recruiting the new person to be abused does not negate that they were victims as well. However, them being victims does not excuse or justify them recruiting another young person to be sexually abused. And in this
Well,
case,
yeah, I mean,
yeah,
most child molesters were themselves abused. That doesn't excuse it. We've accepted that as fact.
absolutely. I just, I get that she was probably to some extent a victim in her own right, but I just, ugh. And I know that they didn't kill her, but the amount of trauma that they put her through, I just, some things I'm just like, you should just be rotting for life. And this is one of those
Honestly,
things.
yeah. So, you know, I guess the happy ending in this story is that Elizabeth is now a child safety advocate and she's married with 3 young children of her own. So she got her happily ever after in a roundabout, fucked up way. And she now travels around, giving talks. And, I believe she has a book out. And so she's doing well.
Good. I hope she's thriving.
I hope she's thriving too. Elizabeth, if you're listening, we hope you're thriving. And that's all I have today for the story of Elizabeth Smart.
Well, we love a survival story on channels like this. I know they're few and far between,
Yeah.
but this is definitely a
Um,
case where, I mean, both of these sisters were so impressive in the way that they strategized, the way that they rationalized and worked through these things. And also for Elizabeth's sister, because I mean, this is coming from somebody who I am not observant. I'm not an observant person, and I wish I
she's
was.
not. It's
No.
LJ has many great qualities, but being observant is not one of
No. And I mean, I'm the first to say it. Like, I'm not observant at all.
them.
So I could never see a person in that type of a situation, life or death, like if it was a life or death situation and you said, where do you know this man from? I don't care. 6 months, 9 months, a year later, it would not come to me. I would never have figured that out. Like, it just amazes
Yeah.
me that at 9, 10 years old, she was able to hone that far. That's impressive.
Yeah, and then Elizabeth like manipulating this man into moving back to Salt Lake City. Good for
We
her.
love her for that. A manipulative
Honestly.
queen doing the Lord's
Absolutely.
work for real, for
Doing
real.
doing the real Lord's work, not the Emmanuel and Hepzibah Lord's work.
God.
God. Okay, folks. Well, with that being said, I think we will wrap this up. Remember, if you have a story that you would like us to cover, you can email us at saypsychorightnow@gmail.com. We are also on Instagram at Say Psycho Right Now, and we are on Facebook. And LJ is going to say our Facebook page name because I can never remember it.
Say Psycho Right Now, a true crime and paranormal podcast. But literally any socials that you guys want to find us on pretty much is just Say Psycho Right Now. We tried to keep
Yeah.
it easy peasy, lemon squeezy.
Not the lemons.
What?
Okay, keep going. I like lemons.
Oh, okay. God, you said lemons, and my brain goes to SpongeBob, where they're like, evil! Every villain is lemons! Do you remember that?
No, I don't.
Stop! I hate that my brain only operates in SpongeBob
Plankton!
quotes. Okay, last one is Patreon. Arguably the most important one. It lets you get episodes early, live episodes, bonus episodes, stickers if you hang in there for 3
She
months.
said stickers.
Stickers! Who doesn't love a sticker?
Who doesn't love a sticker?
God.
God.
So, subscribe if this didn't bother you.
Okay, well.
Oh, and our website, saypsychorightnow.com. It should be live for all folks very soon. If you're listening to this early, it might not be, so don't quote me on that. But
Yeah.
by the time you're listening to this, I really think it should be up because our goal is to get it up and running in April.
Yeah.
It's already fully ready to go. We're just waiting on paperwork.
But yeah, it's gonna be a fun time. So check that out.
Yeah, we got a mural and shit.
And we will see you guys next week.
Bye.
Toodaloo.
If you cut out my SpongeBob thing, I'll kill you.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I will not cut out the SpongeBob.
God.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, don't quote that out. Don't cut that out either.
Okay.
All right.
Oh no! Did we perform a fuckaroni?